For decades, Linda Gray kept the truth buried behind polished smiles and carefully chosen words. But now, at 84, she's done protecting the myth. "Don't touch me, Mom. Don't you ever touch me again." That line, once dismissed as just a scene, now echoes with deeper meaning. Behind the glitz of Dallas and the charm of Larry Hagman's iconic portrayal of J.R. Ewing, Linda witnessed something far more disturbing, something she's finally ready to reveal. Hagman wasn't just the life of the party, he was also its chaos. His off-screen behavior, once seen as harmless fun, spiraled into something darker, more volatile, and deeply unsettling. This isn't just a confession. It's the unraveling of a legend. And once you hear what Linda saw behind the cameras, you'll never see Larry Hagman the same way again. There are moments Linda Gray still can't erase from her memory, scenes that crossed a line so deeply, they left permanent scars. Now, after decades of silence, she's finally ready to reveal the truth, not to tear down Larry Hagman's legacy, but to show the deeply conflicted man behind the charm. When Dallas first hit television screens, Larry became a sensation. His portrayal of J.R. Ewing, ruthless, cunning, unforgettable, turned him into a household name. But off-camera, Linda says the man behind the legend was just as complex, if not more. From the very beginning, Larry commanded attention. His energy was infectious, his humor relentless, and his presence impossible to ignore. Yet behind that magnetic aura was a storm brewing. Linda recalls his unpredictable mood swings, how his charm could flip into chaos in seconds. One minute he was making the crew laugh, and the next, spiraling into outbursts fueled by alcohol. Larry never hid his drinking, he wore it like a badge of honor. Sometimes he showed up to set with a drink already in hand. Other times, he stashed bottles inside props. What looked like confidence was, Linda now says, a mask for something far more dangerous. And behind that mask, she saw a man unraveling before anyone dared to admit it. There were times when Larry Hagman's wild behavior was dismissed as nothing more than his signature charm. The cast and crew often laughed, brushing off his antics as harmless mischief. But Linda Gray knew better. She saw the shift, the thin line between an unpredictable prankster and a man spiraling out of control. One day, in the middle of an emotionally charged scene, Larry derailed everything with a bizarre, unscripted monologue. The rest of the cast chuckled nervously, unsure of how to respond. But Linda felt something else. A chill. A growing sense of dread. In that moment, she realized what others refused to admit, Larry's unpredictability wasn't just eccentricity. It was a warning sign. What troubled her more was how no one dared to stop him. He was the face of Dallas, the ratings machine, the star no one wanted to confront. Producers ignored the signs. Co-stars whispered but stayed silent. Linda, ever the professional, forced herself to smile and carry on. But behind her composure, concern turned into quiet fear. She began watching more closely, how Larry would suddenly retreat into silence after roaring with laughter, how his big persona would flicker like a light struggling to stay on. She saw it in his eyes, those brief, vulnerable moments where the bravado dropped and something wounded peeked through. Larry Hagman was battling something far darker than anyone on that set wanted to acknowledge, and Linda was one of the few who truly saw it. At that point, she started to notice a different aspect of him. However, Linda was not prepared for the extent of his downward spiral. Over the years, Linda Gray saw Larry Hagman continue to revert to what she now calls a tragic pattern. What started out as oddball conduct or quirkiness quickly evolved into something more sinister, a slow-motion collapse that nobody on the set was really able to halt. Hagman's drinking became so bad that it was no longer a part of who he was. His life was being shaped by it. He would occasionally slur his lines without even noticing it, hide vodka in a coffee mug, and drink champagne in between scenes. Nevertheless, he continued to give fans enthralling performances. People found it even more difficult to face the truth as a result. Larry wasn't only having a good time. He was having problems. According to Linda, she felt powerless. Although she was too far away to make any changes, she could see the fractures beginning to appear. She subsequently said, "There were nights I worried if he would wake up at all the next morning, and there were days I worried if he would make it to the end of the episode." On set, there were tales of altercations, producers attempting to control him, and irate co-stars, but nobody was able to make him change. Not when he was the star of a popular program that attracted millions of viewers. The health scares followed. Hagman finally needed a liver transplant after being diagnosed with hepatic cirrhosis in the early 1990s. Later, Linda said that she had anticipated it years earlier. She compared it like watching someone approach a cliff at a leisurely pace. And they simply continue regardless of how loudly you yell. But she remained by his side through it all. She remained silent in public. She didn't distance herself or embarrass him. In a low voice, she wished that he would escape the downward spiral, that the man she had laughed with in between takes would return. But Linda sensed in her heart that something had changed. No longer was Larry's suffering hidden beneath the surface. His eyes, his voice, and the way he occasionally looked straight through her were all etched with it. Then came the time when everything fell apart. Linda claims that one occurrence permanently altered her perception of him. Around Larry Hagman, there was always an air of uncertainty. However, Linda Gray had never experienced anything like what happened on stage one day. It wasn't a simple practical joke. Neither the day nor the morning were difficult. She was shaken by the experience, and it scarred her for life. Innocently enough, the incident started. The actors were getting ready for a crucial scene that called for a great deal of emotional depth and concentration. As they waited for the cameras to roll, everyone was silent. However, Larry suddenly appeared on the set in a way that nobody had anticipated. He wasn't dressed up. He was obviously intoxicated, and he was hardly able to think. Initially, a few crew members chuckled uneasily. People had grown accustomed to Larry's wild behavior. However, things were different this time. He started yelling lines that weren't in the script, making fun of the actual scene. Even the most cynical crew members were taken aback by what he did next. Laughing as though it were a joke, he undressed and bared his body. Stunned, Linda stood there. The whole group froze. Nobody spoke. She recalls the chill that went down her spine because it validated something she had been trying not to acknowledge, not because it was offensive or disturbing. Nobody could or would stop Larry Hagman's disintegration in the open. The shoot was stopped by the director, but there was no conflict. No one confronted him. The network resolved the issue. The video was deleted. The event was never reported to the public. That day, Linda left the set and sat by herself in her trailer. She later said that it was the first time she had given quitting serious thought. Her words, "It was not about being offended. It had to do with recognizing that I was helping someone who was drowning and receiving praise for it." Her perception of him as a person and as a co-star was altered by that encounter. She started to doubt every laugh, every moment, and every memory they had together on film. Was it all a mask, or was it real? She still finds it difficult to discuss it. She had no desire to make fun of him or bring his name into disrepute. However, she was also aware that it would be unfair to herself and everyone else who had to watch it if she pretended it never happened. She remained silent, though. Not to him, not to the fans, nor to the media. But as time passed, the weight of that quiet would only increase. Linda Gray experienced a change after that day on set. Not just in her perception of Larry Hagman, but also in her perception of the machine as a whole. She understood that Hollywood was not only condoning his actions, but also shielding them. And in doing so, it was subtly encouraging everyone in his vicinity to follow suit. Linda had experience in the field. She was aware of how influential networks could conceal scandals and reshape narratives, but this was different. It was a personal matter. In front of scores of others, she had witnessed a friend and coworker reach their lowest point. Furthermore, nobody had the courage to mention anything thereafter, not even in private or in public interviews or meetings. She now acknowledges that during those years, keeping quiet became a survival tactic. Producers made subtle remarks and smiled with a hint of abrasiveness. Let's avoid exaggerating the situation. Let's concentrate on the work, even though Larry is going through anything. It was always the same message. Keep Larry safe, the show safe, and the brand safe. And Linda complied because she thought she was doing the right thing at the time, not because she was worried about her career. Despite everything, she had a strong affection for Larry and did not want to be the one to reveal his unraveling to the world. In a subsequent interview, she stated, "I believed I was being loyal. But in retrospect, I believe I was only afraid of what would happen to him and to us all if I spoke up. The loneliness of it was what made it worst." Fans who looked up to Larry as the talented junior Ewing were not someone she could confide in. She couldn't complain to her co-workers, many of whom were merely trying to maintain their jobs, and she couldn't go to the press either. Her silence turned into a burden that she carried around all the time. Larry's actions would eventually calm down, at least in public. The world would move on, forgetting the cracks that had previously threatened to break everything open, when he received care, underwent a liver transplant, and carried on working. But because Linda had witnessed it all firsthand and had contributed to its concealment, she never forgot. She looks back on that period of time with remorse now, decades later. "I ought to have spoken up." She acknowledges that she knew too much. But in those days, loyalty meant keeping quiet. Nevertheless, despite everything, the confusion, the quiet, the fear, her feelings toward Larry were not ones of hatred. Something far more intricate was involved. Linda Gray never lost her affection for Larry Hagman in spite of all the turmoil, the things she saw, and the times she would never be able to forget. Although their connection was genuine, it was never easy or straightforward. It was based on years of shared scenes, long set days, and poignant moments when the masks came off and the cameras were off. She once laughed and stated, "He drove me crazy," with a tinge of anguish behind her eyes. I loved him, though. Most admirers were unaware that there was intense affection hidden under the awkward silences and stress. In addition to his unpredictable and chaotic nature, Larry had a surprising amount of warmth, generosity, and vulnerability. He repeatedly confided in Linda about his insecurities, his worries about becoming irrelevant, and even his questions about whether he was worthy of his current level of celebrity. She recalled a late night on set when the rest of the crew had long since left and they were sitting by themselves under the studio lights. Unguarded and uncensored, Larry said that he frequently felt like a fake. "People believe that I have everything figured out," he informed her. "But most days I feel like I'm winging it." More than anything else, that honesty struck her. The larger-than-life star briefly vanished, leaving behind a man attempting to bear the burden of his own legacy. Not all of the conversations were that tender, of course. There were times when they fought bitterly. Larry, driven by drink and ego, had the ability to lash out in ways that left scars, and Linda never held back when she was angry. However, the fact that they continued to return to one another despite all of their arguments was what made their relationship special. Not in a romantic sense, but as fellow survivors of a battleground. They would occasionally refrain from talking off-set, interspersed with nostalgic bursts of laughter. Sometimes all that was needed to rekindle the conversation was a single line from a scenario that was delivered perfectly. Their bond persisted despite its unpredictability. Linda Gray never really let go of Larry Hagman because she had witnessed both the best and the worst of him, even when she was angry, felt deceived, and went off-set shaking her head in shock. And even after the cameras stopped shooting, she was still feeling the emotional tug. However, the full force of their relationship and its unsolved tension did not return until Larry's last days. The party was well over by the time Larry Hagman's health really started to deteriorate. The erratic mood swings, the outbursts, and the uncontrolled behavior had subsided. All that was left was a weary-looking guy who had lived longer than some had anticipated, but not without a price. Larry's diagnosis of throat cancer in 2011 marked a sea change. Linda Gray, who had stayed in contact with him over the years, commenced traveling more regularly. Their interactions were quieter now. The banter changed into nonetheless there, however it becomes slower, softer, laced with something unsaid. She may want to see it in his eyes. He knew time was jogging out. In those final months, Linda saw something in Larry she had only glimpsed earlier than regret. He never laid out a proper apology. He did no longer cross again and recount each wrong, but she may want to sense it in his pauses, in the way he held her hand longer than usual, within the moments when he checked out her as though attempting to mention something he nevertheless couldn't quite articulate. In the course of one medical institution go-to, she sat beside him as he drifted inside and outside of sleep. At one factor, he opened his eyes, looked at her, and stated, "You usually knew, did not you?" She did no longer ask him to explain. She just nodded. That moment, she later said, became the nearest component to closure she ever acquired. There were no huge confessions, no dramatic speeches, only a quiet recognition of the entirety they had been through and the whole thing they had avoided announcing for a ways too long. While Larry passed away on November 23, 2012 on the age of 81, Linda was devastated. But she admits she were preparing for it for years. "I had already lost pieces of him." She said this changed into simply the very last goodbye. What amazed her most was the grief that came after. No longer only for the man he turned into, however for the parts of him the arena in no way saw. The kindness, the humor, the self-doubt, the private pain he attempted so tough to cover underneath the cowboy hat. She grieved the man who had made her laugh uncontrollably. The person who once ruined a scene by means of doing a cartwheel in complete gown just to interrupt the anxiety. The man who, for all his flaws, in no way stopped looking to be large than life. "I by no means forgave him," she said once. "However, I never stopped loving him both." And now, with time and distance, Linda Gray is eventually sharing what she held returned for decades. Not to wreck Larry's reminiscence, but to finish it. For years, Linda Gray held her silence out of loyalty, worry, and a quiet hope that the truth would come what may screen itself without her needing to say a word. But now at 83, she now not feels the need to shield a polished model of the beyond. She isn't always indignant. She isn't always sour. She is simply ready. In recent interviews and public appearances, Linda has started commencing up no longer in dramatic inform-alls or stunning exposes, however in calm, reflective conversations. She speaks with care, with precision, and with unmistakable unhappiness. No longer due to the fact she wants to tarnish Larry Hagman's legacy, however because she believes the entire story merits to be heard. "There was so much extra to him than human beings knew," she said. "Yes, he become wild. Sure, he was reckless, but he become also human and he was hurting." Her selection to speak now isn't approximately revenge or relevance. It's far about honesty, approximately peeling back the glossy surface that so many TV icons are wrapped in and showing what lies under. A actual flawed character who made humans snicker, made people angry, and left a complicated path behind. Linda admits that a part of her motivation is deeply private. For many years, she carried the load of reminiscences that no one else noticed. The moments of quiet vulnerability, the harmful highs, the emotional lows. Now, she desires to place those memories into the sector. Now not to unburden herself, however to offer a fuller photo of the man at the back of the legend. Fans still come up to her and speak about Dallas, approximately JR and Sue Ellen, about how their chemistry lit up the display screen, and she smiles. She recollects the good times, but she additionally remembers what it fee. She says that telling the fact now in her very own words is a shape of affection. The type of love that doesn't sugarcoat the past, however honors it by way of telling it whole. "I protected him for so long," she stated. "But I think part of me constantly wanted people to realize he became now not who you watched. He become more. He become much less. He became the entirety right away." And so she speaks, not to rewrite history, but to complete it. Because what she says in her final mirrored image takes the entirety one step in addition and leaves fans in reality speechless. In the long run, Linda homosexual's story isn't approximately blame. It isn't always about scandal. It is approximately complexity, about what it manner to love someone who made things tough, who caused pain, and who regardless of the whole lot mattered deeply. She does no longer call Larry Hagman a villain. She does now not label him a victim either. What she offers as a substitute is an unprecedented type of honesty, the type that comes simplest with age, time, and the readability of distance. He changed into not a monster, she says softly. He turned into a person, a superb, infuriating, complex guy. And that fact incorporates weight. Due to the fact for all the on-screen drama Dallas added, the real tale became unfolding off digital camera in stolen moments, in sharp silences, in the anxiety among actors who were additionally very actual people navigating reputation, stress, and private demons. Linda says she has made peace with the past, no longer by way of forgetting it, however through facing it. By telling the fact finally and letting the world see what she noticed all alongside. Larry Hagman made millions snort. He constructed a career on air of secrecy and swagger. However, Linda Gray noticed something below all of it. Something damaged, something lovely, something actual. And now, as fanatics revisit the legacy of Dallas and the person at the back of Junior E. Ewing, they will recognize greater than simply the person. They'll recognize the tale of a friendship that survived chaos. A bond built on fact, silence, ache, and love. Because ultimately, that is what Linda Gray gave Larry Hagman, even when he did not constantly deserve it.